Over the weekend, one of the reasons we moved up to stage 6 load shedding because Unit 2 at Koeberg suffered a trip. As a result, we lost around 900 megawatts of generation capacity, or roughly one stage. At the moment, Unit 1 is currently undergoing a massive refurbishment to extend its life, so it can continue to work to provide electricity. But is this the right thing to do? Peter Becker is a member of the Koeberg Alliance Group. Peter, good afternoon to you. We're spending quite a lot of money on this refurbishment process. It's a lot like the argument about extending the lives of coal-fired power plants. Should we continue with the refurbishment process at Koeberg?
Well, hi, Stephen, and I think you put your finger on a very important question there, and that what is the cost? So the only actual estimate that we have from Eskom is a 2010 statement that said it would cost 20 billion rand. Now, it's just obvious that that can no longer be the case, although that's a figure that is still recently quoted in the media. So it would be good to know what the actual cost is, because what we need to do is obviously look at the need, the benefit, the risks of doing the refurbishment. So we've estimated, just based on CPI, that it would be at least 40 billion, but it could be more due to forex fluctuations, and of course it's not unknown for an Eskom project to triple in costs based on the original estimates, as has happened with Medupi. So the first step, before we can really answer that question, would be a little more transparency from Eskom in terms of what is this whole project of refurbishment actually going to cost.
Surely, even for Eskom, this is quite a lot of money. It would have to be in its annual report, or even its financial statement at some point. I mean, they can't keep that amount of money hidden forever.
It can't be hidden forever, but it might only come out after the job is done and after the debts are actually incurred. You know, there's another factor there, is that the National Nuclear Regulator is the only authority that can grant a license for a nuclear plant to operate. And that has not yet been granted beyond 2024. So at the moment, Eskom is spending this amount of money with absolutely no guarantee that it's actually going to be able to operate once it's been refurbishment, because at this rate the refurbishment is not going to be complete by the time the license actually expires. But back to your point, is we don't know what it is, and we will eventually find out, but by that time it might be too late to do anything about it.
All right.
There are also other factors.
Peter, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but I feel I must just explain some context. You mentioned the nuclear regulator, and I think just for people who don't know, you sat on the board, you were appointed by the Energy Minister, and then you were fired by Gwele Mantashe. I realize they're one and the same person. You're going to court to challenge that. I don't want anyone to not know that, and from the way that you're nodding, I think I've got the facts right. Let me just put something to you. So the thing about nuclear power is that you pay it all up front. It's not like coal, where you spend a lot of money on Medupi and then you still pay for the coal afterwards. As I understand nuclear power, and I'm absolutely no expert, you pay for it all up front. So if this refurbishment buys us another 20 years of electricity, couldn't it be considered to be a pretty good investment?
Yes, if it does. So there are a few conditions on that, you know, and in order to work out what the levelized cost of electricity will be, if we assume a successful refurbishment, we've got to know what the capital costs are for the project. And for some reason, Eskom is being very cagey about those facts. And you mentioned that it will come out in the annual report, but there are other factors as well. And one example is the Unkelug project. And there's an Unkelug transmission line project that is specifically there to provide backup power to Koeberg in case of grid failure. So that should really be incorporated into the cost of refurbishment of Koeberg, because the only reason that's being done is to allow the plant to continue running beyond 2024. So if we look at all of those costs, we've done a bit of calculation on it, and we'd estimate that it's somewhere between 1 rand per kilowatt hour and 1.80 rand per kilowatt hour, depending on all sorts of assumptions like the weighted average cost of capital and so on. But without knowing an actual transparent business case from Eskom, it's actually impossible to know if it's a good investment or not.
Okay, I mean, if it's 1 rand per kilowatt hour, and again, I'm no expert on all of this, but I think that is probably more expensive than building quite a lot of solar power plants, which might give you a cheaper rate?
Absolutely. And of course, we must be fair and look at the fact that if you install 1 gigawatt of solar, you're not going to get 1 gigawatt of energy out of it all of the time. And generally, the ratio is considered about a third. You'll get a third out of it. But looking at the possible costs of the refurbishment and looking at investing that in both solar and battery storage, it would be a very interesting calculation to do if we had the figures to do that calculation.
Okay. When Koeberg Unit 2 went out over the weekend, I mean, we really feel its impact. I mean, sort of roughly it's one stage of load shedding. I mean, this shows you it's still quite important to the national grid to have these 2 units running at the moment, especially now.
Yeah, it actually shows 2 things. Firstly, as you say, at the moment we're in an absolute crisis. We need every megawatt of power that we can get. So it's been a very unfortunate time for Eskom to decide to take the unit offline. And we know they first tried in 2022. That approval was given coincidentally on the day I was suspended from the Nuclear Regulator Board. And that was an aborted attempt. And it had to be cancelled and redone. And it's well publicized that cost about R1 billion in a claim from Framatome against Eskom for that process. So the other thing that it shows, though, and I find this quite interesting, is often a criticism of renewable energy is that it's intermittent. Sometimes the wind doesn't blow for a day or for a few hours, and the sun goes down at night and so on. But what this tripping of Koeberg Unit 2 has shown us is that for a nuclear plant, each reactor actually needs a backup system because by its nature it's intermittent. So if the Koeberg plant works well, each reactor must be shut down for 6 weeks every 18 months for refueling. So during that 6 weeks, there needs to be a gigawatt of some other source of energy to back up Koeberg when it's down. And what this has shown us is if one is down for maintenance or for refueling or whatever, and the other unit trips, we actually need backup power for the output of the entire plant. And the question that arises then is if we have to have that backup for the entire plant, do we actually need the plant at all? And if you add to that the fact that we don't know how much it costs, that Eskom is being very secretive about that for some reason, and of course the risks associated with nuclear power, it becomes quite questionable if it's possible to make a good argument for needing Koeberg in the long term.
I mean, I realize that you're quite critical of nuclear power, Peter. I mean, there is an argument for it, and let me just put it to you so that you can argue with me. And the argument for it is that, you know, it provides, largely speaking, a sort of baseload power. It always works. The cost is up front. And apart from maybe 3 or 4 instances around the world, it's been really very safe. I mean, very few deaths as a result, and Chernobyl was very different to this design, for example. The point I'm making is there is an argument for nuclear power.
Yeah, just as a side point, I always struggle with using number of deaths as the only metric for human suffering. So during my visit to the Fukushima area, I spoke to families who had to vacate their homes. They can't go back there for 300 years, how families were separated and so on. So I think very few other sources of energy could require a city or a village to have to be evacuated for 300 years. But you're right about if you measure purely on number of deaths, it's low. But on your story about baseload, firstly, I think it's well publicized that the term baseload has long reached its sell-by date. We no longer have to have a certain source of energy to match a certain type of load. And the fact that the word load appears in baseload shows that it's inappropriate to apply it to a generation technology. A coal plant is not a load, and therefore it can't be a base load. What they're trying to say, and historically this was true, is that to satisfy the lowest load or the base load, that's the demand in the country, in the past they would match that with plants that had a consistent output, and that would be called then a base load plant as a kind of shorthand. But we're well past that time, and I think it's time that we should really drop using the word baseload for a generation plant. But on your point about it provides consistent and ongoing power, if we look at Koeberg, is that the case? I mean, we had the entire plant drop out of operation because something tripped. And if you look at new plants, perhaps it would be a slightly different story in terms of reliability. But maintaining a 40-year-old nuclear plant is an incredibly complex thing from an engineering point of view. I mean, take, for example, a valve or a meter fails. Now you've got to try and find a supplier who can give you that same model that was made 40 years ago. And obviously that's going to be impossible. So what do? Do you have a custom one made? Then how do you do your quality control if it's a one-off instead of a whole run? Or do you replace it with a digital meter of some kind? But now if you don't have that recertified as fitting into your entire system, you could compromise the safety of the plant. So it's a very, very difficult thing. Same way if you had a 40-year-old car, to find parts for it would be a nightmare. And it's very difficult to keep Koeberg running reliably. And I think that's been well demonstrated by the fact that if you look over the past 3 or 4 years, there's been about a 50% energy availability factor from Koeberg. So it's a little bit of a myth that in Eskom's case, and I'm not talking about the world generally, but in South Africa, in Eskom's case, Koeberg has not provided baseload, even by that outdated definition of baseload.
Peter Becker, really appreciate the time from the Koeberg Alliance Group. Thank you very much indeed.